One day, a monster came into town, and nobody liked the monster because the monster was different. All the monster wanted was to get its baby, because an evil scientist man had captured the monster's baby. Then a little girl stepped forward.
Oi, 博士
I like the monster. I like the monster. I like the monster. I like the monster.
So the scientist let the baby go.
怪物くんに赤ちゃんを返させてあげて
The monster and its baby jumped back into the ocean.
さようなら怪物くん
But no one ever understood the monster.
誰も怪物くんを分かっていない
Hello, bruvs. We're back with Donna Tartt's The Little Friend. And we are starting chapter 6. Chapter 6, not the 6th. I plead the 6th if I can't plead the 5th. I don't even know what the 6th Amendment is anymore. But here we are. Let me set this chat up and then I will start reading. Rating, I tell you. Come on, let me open the chat.
I'm not the monster. I'm not the monster. I'm not the monster, buddy.
V25. All right. We'll open the chat and we shall start reading. Exciting times. Chapter 6 of Donna Tartt's The Little Friend. The funeral. Hospitality was the keynote of life in those days, and Edie, or said Edie, her voice clear, declamatory, rose effortlessly over the hot wind roaring through the car windows. Grandly, without bothering to signal, she swept into the left lane and cut in front of a log truck. The Oldsmobile was a lush, curvaceous manatee of a car. Edie had purchased it from Colonel Chipper D's car lot in Vicksburg back in the 1950s. A vast tract of empty seat stretched between Edie on the driver's side and Harriet slouched against the opposite door. Between them, next to Edie's straw purse with the wooden handles, was a plaid thermos of coffee and a box of donuts. Out at Tribulation, Mother's cousins would show up out of the clear blue to stay weeks at a time, and nobody thought a thing in the world about it, Edie was saying. The speed limit was 55, but she was proceeding at her usual leisurely motoring pace, 40 miles an hour. In the mirror, Harriet could see the driver of the log truck slapping his forehead and making impatient gestures with his open palm. Don't go to sleep, buddy. You're going to make this. No, I'm not talking about the Memphis cousins, said Edie. I'm talking about the cousins from Baton Rouge, Miss Ollie and Jules and Mary Willard, and little Aunt Fluff. Harriet stared bleakly out the window. Sawmills and pine barrens, preposterously rosy in the early morning light, Warm, dusty wind blew her hair in her face, whipped monotonously in a loose flap of upholstery on the ceiling. Rattled in the cellophane panel of the donut box. She was thirsty, hungry too, but there was nothing to drink but the coffee, and the donuts were crumbly and stale. Edie bought day-old donuts, even though they were only a few cents cheaper than fresh. Mother's uncle had a small plantation down there around Covington. Angevine, it was called, said Edie, plucking up a napkin. With her free hand in what could only be called a kingly manner, like a king accustomed to eating with his hands. She took a big bite of her donut. Libby used to take the three of us down there on the old number 4 train, weeks at a time. Miss Ollie had a little dog trot house out back with a wood stove and table and chairs, and we loved to play out in that little dog trot house better than anything. The backs of Harriet's legs were stuck to the car seat. Irritably, she shifted around and tried to get comfortable. They'd been in the car 3 hours and the sun was high and hot. Every so often, Edie considered trading in the Oldsmobile for something with air conditioning or a radio that worked, but she always changed her mind at the last minute, mainly for the secret pleasure of watching Roy Dahl wring his hands and dance around in anguish. It drove Mr. Dahl crazy that a well-placed old Baptist lady like Edie rode around town in a car 20 years old. Sometimes when the new cars came out, he spun by Edie's house late in the afternoon and dropped off an unrequested tester. What's up with you, bruvs? Usually a top-of-the-line Cadillac. Just drive it for a few days, he'd say, palms in the air. See what you think. Edie strung him along cruelly, pretending to fall in love with the proffered vehicle. Then, just as Mr. Dial was drawing up the papers, return it, suddenly opposed to the color, or the power windows, or complaining of some microscopic flaw, some rattle in the dashboard, or sticky lock button. It still says Hospitality State on the Mississippi license plate, but in my opinion, true hospitality died out here in the first half of the present century. My great-grandfather was dead against the building of the old Alexandria Hotel back before the war, said Edie, raising her voice over the long, insistent horn blast of the truck behind her. Them. He said that he himself was more than happy to put up any respectable travelers who came to town. Edie, that man back there is honking at you. Let him, said Edie, who had settled in at her own comfortable speed. I think he wants to pass. It won't hurt him to slow down a little bit. Where does he think he's taking those logs in such a great big hurry? The landscape, sandy clay hills, endless pines, was so raw and strange looking that it made Harriet's stomach hurt. Everything she saw reminded her that she was far from home. Even the people in the neighboring cars looked different. Sun-reddened, with broad, flat faces and farm clothes, not like the people from her own town. They passed a dismal little cluster of businesses. Freelawn Spraying Company, Tunes AA Transmission, New Dixie Stone and Gravel. A rickety old black man in coveralls and orange hunting cap was bobbing along the shoulder of the road carrying a brown grocery bag. What would Ida think when she came to work and found her gone? She would be arriving just about now. Harriet's breath quickened a little at the thought. Sagging telephone wires, patches of collards and corn, ramshackle houses with dooryards of packed dirt. Harriet pressed her forehead to the warm glass. Maybe she'd realized that she couldn't threaten to pack up and quit every single time she got mad about something or other. A middle-aged black man in glasses was tossing feed from a Crisco can to some red chickens solemnly. He raised a hand at the car and Harriet waved back, so energetically that she felt a little embarrassed. She was worried about Healy, too. Though he'd seemed pretty certain that his name wasn't on the wagon, still she didn't like the thought that it was sitting up there, waiting for someone to find it. To think what would happen if they traced it back to Healy made her feel ill. Don't think about it, she told herself. On they drove. Shacks gave way to more woods, with occasional flat fields that smelled of pesticide. In a grim little clearing, a fat white woman wearing a maroon shirt and shorts, one foot encased in a surgical boot, was slinging wet clothes on a line off to the side of her trailer home. She glanced at the car but didn't wave. Suddenly, Harriet was jolting from her thoughts by a sequel of brakes and a turn that slung her into the door and upset the box of donuts. Edie had turned across traffic into a bumpy little country road that led to the camp. Sorry, dear, said Edie breezily, leaning over to write her purse. I don't know what they make these signs so little that you can't even read them. Why they make these signs so little that you can't even read them until you get right up on them. In silence, they jostled down the gravel road. A silver tube of lipstick rolled across the seat. Harriet caught it before it fell. Cherries in the snow, said the label on the bottom, and dropped it back in Edie's straw handbag. We're certainly in Jones County now, said Edie gaily. Her backlit profile, dark against the sun, was sharp and girlish. Only the line of her throat and her hands on the steering wheel, naughty, freckled, betrayed her age, and her crisp white shirt, plaid skirt, and two-toned correspondent Oxfords. She looked like some enthusiastic 1940s newspaper reporter out to chase down the big story. Do you remember old Newt Knight, the deserter from your Mississippi history, Harriet? The Robin Hood of the piney woods, so he called himself. He and his men were poor and sorry, and they didn't want to fight a rich man's war, so they holed up down here in the backwoods and wouldn't have a thing to do with the Confederacy. The Republic of Jones, that's what they called themselves. The cavalry sent bloodhounds after them, and the old cracker women choked those dogs to death with red pepper. That's the kind of gentleman you've got down here in Jones County. Edie, said Harriet, watching her grandmother's face as she spoke, maybe you should get your eyes checked. I can read just fine. Yes, ma'am, at one time, said Edie regally. These backwoods were full of Confederate renegades. They were too poor to have any slaves themselves, and they resented those rich enough to have them, so they seceded from the secession, hoeing their sorry little corn patches out here in the pine woods. Of course, they didn't understand that the war was really about states' rights. To the left, the woods opened onto a field. At the very sight of it, the small, sad bleachers, the soccer nets, the ragged grass, Harriet's heart plunged. Some tough-looking older girls were punching a tetherball, their slaps and oofs ringing out hard and audible in the morning stillness. Over the scoreboard, a hand-lettered sign read, "De Selby Frosh, there are no limits." Harriet's throat constricted. Suddenly, she realized she made a terrible mistake. Now, Nathan Bedford Forrest was not from the wealthiest of the most cultivated families, or the most cultivated family in the world, but he was the greatest general of the war, Edie was saying. Yes, ma'am. Fustus with the mostus was Forrest. Edie, said Harriet in a small, fast voice, I don't want to stay home. Let's go home. I don't want to stay here. Let's go home. Home? Edie sounded amused, not even surprised. Nonsense. You're going to have the time of your life. No, please. I hate it here. Then why'd you want to come? Harriet had no answer for this. Bounding the old familiar corner at the bottom of the hill, a gallery of forgotten horrors opened before her. The patchy grass, the dust-dulled pines, the particular yellow, red color of the gravel, which was the uncooked chicken livers. How could she have forgotten how much she loathed this place, how miserable she'd been every single minute? Up ahead, on the left, the pass gate beyond the head counselor's cabin sunk in threatening shade. Above the door was a homemade cloth banner with a dove on it that read in fat, hippie letters, "Rejoice." Edie, please, said Harriet quickly. I changed my mind. Let's go. Edie, gripping the steering wheel, swung around and glared at her. Light-colored eyes, predatory and cold. Eyes that Chester called sure shot because they seemed made to look down the barrel of a gun. Harriet's eyes, little sure shot, Chester sometimes called her, was just as light and chilling, but for Edie, it was not pleasant to meet her own stare so fixedly and in miniature. She was unaware of any sorrow or anxiety in her grandchild's rigid expression, which struck her only as insolence, and aggressive insolence at that. "Don't be silly," she said, callously, and glanced back at the road, just in time to keep from running off into a ditch. "You'll love it here. In a week you'll be screaming and carrying on because you don't want to come home." Harriet stared at her in amazement. "Edie," she said, "you wouldn't like it here yourself. You wouldn't stay with these people for $1,000,000. Oh, Edie." Meanwhile, in falsetto, oh, Jesus Christ, I can't read. "Oh, Edie," meanly in falsetto, Edie mimicked Harriet's voice. Take me back to camp. That's what you'll be saying when it's time to go." Harriet was so stung that she couldn't speak. "I won't," she managed to say at last. "I won't. I won't." "Yes, you will," sang Edie, chin high in the smug, merry voice that Harriet detested. "And yes, you will," even louder without looking at her. Suddenly a clarinet honked, a shuddering note which was partly barnyard bray and partly country howdy. Dr. Vance with clarinet heralding their arrival. Dr. Vance was not a real doctor, a medical doctor, only a sort of glorified Christian band director. He was a Yankee, with thick, bushy eyebrows and big teeth like a mule. He was a big wheel on the Baptist youth circuit, and it was Adelaide who had pointed out correctly that he was a dead ringer for the famous Tenniel drawing of the Mad Hatter and Alice in Wonderland. "Welcome, ladies," he crowed, leaning into Edie's rolled-down window. "Praise the Lord." "Praise the Lord," he says, actually. "Here, here," replied Edie, who did not care for the more evangelical, I can't say it, evangelical tone which sometimes crept into Dr. Vance's conversation. "Here's our little camper. I guess we'll get her checked in, and then I'll be going." Dr. Vance, tucking his chin down, leaned in the window to grin at Harriet. His face was a rough, stony red. Coldly, Harriet noted the hair in his nostrils, the stains between his large, square teeth. "Oh, man." Dr. Vance drew back theatrically, as if singed by Harriet's expression. Whew. He raised an arm. He sniffed his armpits, then looked at Edie. "Thought maybe I forgot to put my deodorant on this morning." Harriet stared at her knees. "Even if I have to be here," she told herself, "I don't have to pretend I like it." Dr. Vance wanted his campers to be loud, outgoing, boisterous, and those who didn't rise naturally enough into the camp spirit he heckled and teased and tried to pry open by force. "What's wrong? Can't you take a joke? Don't you know how to laugh at yourself?" If a kid was too quiet for any reason, Dr. Vance would make sure they got doused with the water balloon, that they had to dance in front of everybody like a chicken, or chase a greased pig in a mud pit, or wear a funny hat. "Harriet," said Edie after an awkward pause, no matter what Edie said otherwise. Dr. Vance made her uncomfortable too, and Harriet knew it. Dr. Vance blew a sour note on the clarinet, and when this too failed to get Harriet's attention, put his head in at the window and stuck his tongue out at her. "I am among the enemy," Harriet told herself. She would have to hold fast and remember why she was here. For as much as she hated Camp de Selby, it was the safest place to be at the moment. Dr. Vance whistled a derisive note, insulting. Harriet grudgingly glanced at him. There was no use resisting. He would just keep hammering at her, and he dropped his eyebrows like a sad clown and stuck out his bottom lip. "A pity party isn't much of a party," he said. "Know why? Because there's only room for one." Harriet, face aflame, sneaked a glance past him, out the window. Gangly pines, a line of girls in swimsuits tiptoed past, gingerly, their legs and feet splashed with red mud. "The power of the Highland chiefs is broken," she told herself. "I have fled my country and gone to the heather." "Problems at home?" she heard Dr. Vance inquire, rather sanctimoniously. "Certainly not. She's just, Harriet is a bit big for her britches," said Edie in a clear and carrying voice. A sharp, ugly memory rose in Harriet's mind. Dr. Vance pushing her on stage in the hula hoop contest, the camp roaring with laughter at her dismay. "Well," Dr. Vance chuckled, big britches is one condition we certainly know how to cure around here. Do you hear that, Harriet? Harriet! I don't, said Edie with a little sigh. I don't know what's got into her. Oh, 1 or 2 skit nights and a hot potato race or two, and we'll get her warmed up. The skit nights. Confused memories rose in a clamor. Stolen underpants. Water poured in her bunk. Look, Harriet wets the bed, in a girl's voice crying. You can't sit here. Look, here comes Miss Book Scholar. Well, hey, this was Miss Dr. Vance's wife. Her voice, high-pitched and countrified, swaying amiably toward them in her polyester short set. Mrs. Vance, or Miss Patsy, as she liked the campers to call her, was in charge of the girls' side of the camp, and she was as bad as Dr. Vance, but in a different way. Touchy-feely, intrusive, asking too many personal questions about boyfriends, bodily functions, and the likes. Though Miss Patsy was her official nickname, the girls called her the nurse. Hey, hon. In through the car window she reached and pinched Harriet on the upper arm. How you doing, girl? Twist, twist. Look at you. Look at you. Looky here. Well, hello, Mrs. Vance, said Edie. How do you do? Edie perversely liked people like Mrs. Vance because they gave her the space to be especially lofty and grand. Well, come on, y'all. Let's head up to the office. Everything Mrs. Vance said, she said with unnatural pep. Like the women in the Miss Mississippi pageant or on the Lawrence Welk show. Gosh, you're all grown up, girl, she said to Harriet. I know you're not going to get in any more fistfights this time, are you? Dr. Vance in turn gave Harriet a hard look that she did not like. At the hospital, Farish played and replayed the scenario of their grandmother's accident, speculating, theorizing all night long and into the next day, so that his brothers had grown very, very tired of listening to him. Dull, red-eyed with fatigue, they slouched around in the waiting room of intensive care, partly listening to him, but also partly watching a cartoon program about a dog solving a mystery. If you move, he's going to bite you, Ferris said, addressing the air, almost as if he was talking to the absent Gum. You shouldn't have moved. I don't care if he's laying in your lap. He had stood, running his hands through his hair, and begun to pace, disturbing their view of the television. Farsh, said Eugene loudly, recrossing his legs. Gum had to drive the car, didn't she? She didn't have to drive it off in a ditch, said Danny. Ferris drew his eyebrows down. You couldn't have knocked me out of that driver's seat, he said belligerently. I would have sat still as a mouse. If you move, he made a smooth skating motion with the flat of his palm. You've threatened him. He's going to defend himself. What the hell is she going to do, Farish? A snake is coming through the roof of the damn car. Suddenly, Curtis clapped his hands and pointed at the television. Gum, he exclaimed. Farish wheeled around. After a moment, Eugene and Danny burst into horrifying laughter. In the cartoon, the dog and a group of young people were trooping through a spooky old castle. A grinning skeleton hung on the wall, along with a bunch of trumpets and axes. And strange to say, the skeleton bore a strong resemblance to Gum. Suddenly, it flew off the wall and sailed after the dog, who ran yowling. That, said Eugene. He was having a hard time getting it out. That's what she looked like when the snake was after her. Ferris, without a word, turned to look at them in a wariness and despair. Curtis, aware that he'd done something wrong, stopped laughing instantly, staring at Farish with a disturbed look on his face. But just at this instant, Dr. Breedlove appeared in the doorway. Striking them all into silence, your grandmother's conscious, he said. It looks like she's going to pull through. We've got her off the tubes. Farish put his face in his hands. Off the breathing tubes, anyway. She's still got the IV since her heartbeat hasn't stabilized yet. Would you like to see her? Solemnly, they all threaded single file behind him, all except Curtis, happy enough to stay watching Scooby-Doo, through a wilderness of machines and mysterious equipment to a curtained area concealing Gum. Though she lay very still and the stillness itself was frightening, she actually did not look much more ragged than usual except for her eyelids, which drooped half shut from muscle paralysis. Well, I'll leave you alone for a minute now, the doctor said, energetically rubbing his hands. But just a minute. Don't tire her out. Ferris made his way to the bed first. It's me, he said, leaning close. Her eyes fluttered slowly. She lifted a hand from the coverlet, which Ferris clasped in both his own. Who done this to you, he said in a stern-sounding voice, and bent his head close to her lips to listen. After a moment or two, she said, I don't know. Her voice was dry and wispy and very faint. All I seen was some kids off in the distance. Ferris, shaking his head, stood and smacked his closed fist into his palm. He walked to the window and stood looking out into the parking lot. Forget about kids, Eugene said. You know who I figured when I heard this? Porton Stiles. His arm was still in a sling from his own snake bite. Or Buddy. They always said Buddy had a hit list, that there was people he was coming after someday. It wasn't any of them people, said Ferris, glancing up with a sudden cutting intelligence. All this started at the mission the other night. Eugene said, Don't look at me like that. It's not my fault. You think Loyal did it, said Danny to Ferris. How could he, said Eugene. He left a week ago. Well, we know one thing for damn sure. It's his snake. No question about that, Ferris said. Well, it was you that asked him and his snakes to come here, said Eugene angrily. Not me. I mean, I'm scared to go in my own place now. I said it was his snake, said Ferris, tapping his foot with agitation. I didn't say he was the one that had thrown it. See, Ferris, that is what bothers me, though, Danny said. Who broke that windshield? If they were looking for product, Danny noticed Eugene looking at him funny. He stopped talking and shoved his hands in his pockets. There was no need to go on about the drugs in front of Gum and Eugene. You think it was Dolphus, he said to Ferris? Or somebody working for Dolphus, maybe. Ferris thought about it. No, he said. All these snakes and shit ain't Dolphus's style. He'd just send somebody down to cut your ass up. You know what I keep wondering about, Danny said? That girl who come upstairs to the door that night. I was thinking about her too, said Ferris. I didn't get a good look at her. Where'd she come from? What was she doing hanging around outside the house? Danny shrugged. You didn't ask her? Look, man, Danny said, trying to keep his voice even. There was an awful lot going on that night. And you let her get away? You said you saw a kid, said Ferris to Gum. Black or white, boy or girl? Yeah, Gum, said Danny. What'd you see? Well, I'll tell you the truth, said the grandmother faintly. I didn't get a good look. You know how my eyes are. Was it one? One more than one? Or more than one? I didn't see a whole lot. When I run off the road, I heard a kid screaming and laughing from up on that overpass. That girl, Eugene said to Ferris, was down on the square watching Loyal and me preach earlier in the night. I remember her. She was riding a bicycle. She wasn't on any bicycle when she come to the mission, said Danny. She ran away on foot. I'm just telling you what I saw. I believe I seen a bicycle, come to think of it, said Gum. I can't be sure. I want to talk to this girl, Ferris said. Y'all say you don't know who she is. She told us her name, but she couldn't make up her mind. First it was Mary Jones, then it was Mary Johnson. Would you know her if you saw her again? I'd know her, said Eugene. I was standing there with her for 10 minutes. I got a good look at her face up close. So did I, Danny said. Ferris compressed his lips. Are the cops involved in this? He said abruptly to his grandmother. Have they asked you any questions? I didn't tell him a thing. Good. Awkwardly, Ferris patted his grandmother on the shoulder. I'm on find out who done this to you, he said. And when I find them, you bet they'll be sorry. Sorry, damn it. Gonna be goddamn sorry. How many more pages I can go through before it starts down? That's right, I was gonna stop at 358. All right. Ida's last few days at work were like the last few days before Weenie died. Weenie was a cat. Those endless hours of lying on the kitchen floor beside his box, and part of him still there, but most of him, the best part, gone already. LeSueur's peas, his box had said. The black lettering was stamped in Allison's memory with all the sickness of despair. She had lain with her nose only inches away from those letters, trying to breathe in time with his fast, agonizing little gasps, as if with her own lungs she could buoy him up How vast the kitchen was, so low down, so late at night. All those shadows. Even now, Weenie's death had the waxy sheen of the linoleum in Edie's kitchen. It had the crowded feel of her glass front cabinets, an audience of plates ranked in galleries, goggling helplessly, the useless cheer of red dishcloths and cherry-patterned curtains, those dumb, well-meaning objects, cardboard box, cherry curtains, and jumbled fiestaware, had pressed close in Allison's grief, sat up and watched with her all the long, awful night. Now, with Ida leaving, nothing in the house shared Allison's sorrow or reflected it, but objects. The gloomy carpets, the cloudy mirrors, the armchairs hunched and grieving, and even the tragic old tall case clock holding itself very rigid and proper, as if it were about to collapse into sobs. Within the china cabinet, the Vienna bagpipers and crinolined Dolton ladies gestured imploringly, this way and that, cheeks hectic, their dark little gazes hollow and stunned. Ida had things to do. She cleaned out the refrigerator. She took everything out of the cabinets and wiped them down. She made banana bread in a casserole or two and wrapped them in tinfoil and put them in the freezer. She talked and even hummed, and she seemed cheerful enough, except that in all her rushing around, she refused to meet Allison's eye. Once Allison thought she caught her crying. Gingerly, she stood in the doorway. "Are you crying?" she asked. Ida Rude jumped, then pressed a hand to her chest and laughed. "Bless your heart," she cried. "Ida, are you sad?" But Ida just shook her head and went back to work, and Allison went to her room and cried. Later on, she would regret that she'd wasted one of her few remaining hours with Ida by going up to her bedroom to cry alone. But at the moment, standing there in the kitchen, watching Ida clean out the cabinets, with her back turned, had been too sad to bear. So sad that it gave Allison a panicky, breathless, choking feeling to remember it. Somehow Ida was already gone. As warm and solid as she was, she had already turned into a memory, a ghost, even as she stood in her white nurse's shoes in the sunny kitchen. Allison walked to the grocery and got a cardboard box for Ida to carry her cuttings in so they wouldn't get broken during the trip. With what money she had, $32, old Christmas money, she bought Ida everything she could think of that Ida might want or need. Cans of salmon, which Ida loved to eat for lunch with crackers, maple syrup, knee-high stockings, and a fancy bar of English lavender soap, Fig Newtons, a box of Russell Stover chocolates, a booklet of stamps, a pretty red toothbrush, and a tube of striped toothpaste, and even a large jar of one-a-day vitamins. Allison carried it all home and then spent a long time that evening out on the back porch wrapping up Ida's collection of rooted cuttings, each snuff tin and plastic cup in its own carefully fashioned sleeve of wet newspaper. In the attic was a pretty red box full of Christmas lights. Allison had dumped them all out on the floor and carried the box down to her bedroom to repack the presents when her mother pattered down the hallway, her pace light, unconcerned, and put her head in at the door. "It's lonesome here without Harriet, isn't it?" she asked brightly. Her face was shiny with cold cream. "Do you want to come in my room and watch television?" Allison shook her head. She was disturbed. This was very unlike her mother, to go around after 10 at night taking an interest, issuing invitations. "What are you doing?" "I think you ought to come in with me and watch TV," said her mother, when Allison did not answer. "Okay," said Allison. She stood up. Her mother was looking at her strangely. Allison, in an agony of embarrassment, glanced away. Sometimes, especially when the two of them were alone together, she sensed keenly her mother's disappointment that she was herself and not Robin. Her mother couldn't help this. In fact, she tried touchingly hard to conceal it, but Allison knew that her very existence was a reminder of what was missing. And in deference to her mother's feelings, she did her best to stay out of the way and make herself small and inconspicuous around the house. The next few weeks would be difficult with Ida gone and Harriet away. "You don't have to come watch TV," her mother finally said. "I just thought you might want to." Allison felt her face growing red. She avoided her mother's eye. All the colors in the bedroom, including the box, seemed far too acid and bright. After her mother left again, Allison finished packing the box and then put the money left over into an envelope. In with the book of stamps, a school picture of herself and her address, carefully printed on a sheet of good stationery. Then she tied the box up with a string of green tinsel. Much later, in the middle of the night, Allison woke with a start from a bad dream. A dream she'd had before of standing before a white wall only inches from her face. In the dream, she was unable to move, and it was as if she would have to go on looking at the blank wall for the rest of her life. She lay quietly in the dark, staring at the box on the floor by her bed, until the street lamps went off and the room was blue with the dawn. At last, she got out of bed in her bare feet with a straight pin from the bureau. She sat cross-legged by the box and spent a laborious hour or so pricking out tiny secret messages in the cardboard until the sun was up and the room was light again. Ida's last day. Ida, we love you, the messages on the box said. Ida B. Brownlee. Come back, Ida. Don't forget me, Ida. Love. That's the end of Ida. And the funeral continues next time, bruv. This same channel. This same bat channel. This same bad channel. The same bad bat channel. All right, bruvs. That's all. Goodbye.